I would start today talking about the ethics and justice dimensions of low carbon transitions. This is a really nice segue from Marie Claire's, which is kind of about power and decentralization in politics. I often begin, especially for those of you that aren't used to seeing these words energy and justice next to each other, or electrons and ethics, or oil and morality next to each other, with the justification as to why energy systems impinge on justice issues. And I just want to kind of emphasize four different aspects of justice. The first is we may be quite accustomed here in Europe to watch football games at night on TV and drink cold beer, but in a huge chunk of the world, there are still communities that lack any access to modern energy whatsoever. They've never seen a refrigerator. They've never seen an electric light bulb. They don't have the internet or mobile phones. And in places like India, you still have tens of millions of people who rely on solid fuels for cooking, like this huge lump of coal, which is ironically being mined by a young child, which will then be used to help fuel modern cooking devices for other children. So it also emphasizes a trade-off as well, that sometimes when you eradicate energy poverty, you actually embed one type of energy poverty. Here, closer to where Tomislav is in Eastern Europe, people are still dealing with the impacts of the Chernobyl disaster, which, even though it happened in 1986, still has pretty high rates of thyroid cancer in places like Belarus and the Ukraine. There's even a condition called Chernobyl heart. Something like 70% of people from the red zone are still suffering from things like birth defects and highly abnormal rates of cancer. This shows you two thyroid cancer victims in Minsk. And this photograph was taken not in the 1980s or 1990s, but in 2007. So the boy on the right is only 11 years old. So this also underscores another justice issue. Who suffers when energy systems go wrong, when we have catastrophic accidents? And it also emphasizes another trade-off. Is it okay to have a small group of people like this suffer from energy supply when you have hundreds of millions of them that benefited? Because nuclear power provided low-cost electricity among many former Soviet republics that lifted them out of poverty and helped modernize their economies. Halfway around the world in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'll talk about this more in my talk today, we also have communities that are extracting metals and minerals like cobalt, lithium, copper, rare earths, cadmium, and a bunch of others that we need for our innovations here to digitize and decarbonize. Things like computer servers, monitors, in-home displays, batteries, electric shafts, motors, all depend, fuel cells, nuclear reactors, all depend on minerals that are currently being extracted in very unsustainable ways. And in a way, it doesn't eliminate environmental inequalities, it just shifts them around the world. So they're obscured. And finally, very close to us in the UK and in Norway, what happens when you decarbonize transport? Many of the vehicles that you displace, the conventional petroleum fueled vehicles, don't disappear. They don't just go poof. They instead get shifted and shipped to places like Eastern Europe or, again, sub-Saharan Africa. This shows you cars that failed European emission standards for resale in Accra, Ghana. So again, decarbonization doesn't eliminate injustice, it redistributes it. You also see, we did a special issue a few years ago looking at transport and mobility innovations and who the early adopters are. And this is kind of also interesting because the adopters of things like car sharing or automated mobility are not the average household or the average person. Teslas tend to be adopted by upper class white men in Norway. Automated vehicles also tend to be adopted by those who are a bit younger, but also have higher incomes. And so, again, we see disparities in how we have access to new innovations that cut across demographic areas. I could also talk about race. I could also talk more about gender. I could talk about class and education. That means, I think, that energy justice is not some peripheral concern. It belongs centrally in an energy policy or energy studies agenda. It's also why Marie Claire and I teach a master's course on energy, of which energy justice is one of the courses, because we think it is that central to discussions about energy technology, energy policy, and energy decision making. We frame energy justice very loosely around kind of four themes. It's around the costs and hazards and the negative disamenities of energy and how they're distributed, pollution. But it's also about the benefits. How fairly can we access energy technologies? How fairly are they owned, which is something Marie-Claire was talking about in her presentation. But it's also not only about costs and benefits, it's also about the procedures and the policymaking and the planning and the governance, free, prior, informed consent, or even the social movements behind energy systems and decisions. And finally, because you can talk about costs and benefits and procedures in a very abstract way, it is also about vulnerable groups and recognition, where we maybe have special attention to the homeless, to the disabled, to refugees, to the poor, or other very marginalized groups, ethnic minorities, indigenous peoples. That means energy justice, if you want to be kind, offers you a very holistic prism by which to evaluate energy things. If you want to be unkind, it's a very messy heuristic, because as you can see on the left, it blends together what would traditionally be energy sustainability analysis, availability analysis, and accessibility analysis. So we're not just looking at security or carbon or poverty, but all of them together. And if you look on the right, it is also a very much interdisciplinary lens that demands we sit at this nexus between politics, policy, environmental science, environmental studies, economics, and behavior. So whether you like it or not, it gives you a very holistic or messy picture of energy pathways and decisions and transitions. My colleagues, Raphael and Darren, have done good work trying to tie energy justice with just transitions. These are usually related terms, but they're not identical. Here you can see, however, Raphael and Darren are taking the justice dimensions that I just mentioned, distribution, procedure, recognition, and applying them to what a just transition might be. To contextualize energy justice across space, where you take more appreciation of context, and also time, or the speed or the rapidity of what an energy transition is. Generally, energy justice has been applied kind of two ways within the field, and it's annoying. We never named these. Maybe we should have. We should have called them something. The first approach, for lack of a better term, is called the tenants approach. This takes four broad tenets of justice, like I said, distribution, procedure, cosmopolitanism, recognition, or things like restorative justice or corrective justice. You can add these on as well. And it applies these different tenets or fields of justice to a topic like EVs, and each different tenet brings to the view a different aspect of justice. And you can see here how we've applied these four tenets to electric mobility in the Nordic region. Kirsten Jenkins has a very nice review you can all read later if you want, that shows the value of these tenets and how they cut very nicely across both evaluative and normative perspectives. So it's not just that we describe with energy justice analysis, we also prescribe and try to think about. Someone's taking photos, apparently. The other way in which we've applied them, for lack of a better term, is the principles approach, where we initially started off with 8 principles based on some of our books, and now they've been extended into 10 principles. And you can see the principles, voila, here. These principles are qualitative. You could try to quantify them. They're not hierarchical, although you could put them in a hierarchy. We kind of say that all 10 principles are equally important, and they're supposed to serve as a guide for how you can evaluate a technology, a program, a policy. As you can probably sense or intuit, most of these 10 principles are very difficult to meet. And as you start adding principles, it becomes more difficult. So I struggle to think through an energy option that meets all 10, maybe wind energy or solar energy in some contexts, maybe energy efficiency, but even then it depends on how, because you can equally do energy efficiency or solar energy in ways that don't meet a lot of these different criteria. In our work, we often operationalize these principles by using a subset. So in this article, looking at 4 household innovations in the UK, energy service contracts, electric vehicles, solar panels, and heat retrofits, you can see we only used 4 principles. We could have used 10, but it was a mess. We just narrowed to 4 and showed how troublingly across these different innovations, you had both plus and minus intersections with justice. So unfortunately, no innovation was net just or unjust. It was a pit of justice trade-offs. And the strength of the plus or the minus indicates the strength of the evidence behind those types of trade-offs. What's also interesting about this energy justice work is it doesn't just exist in some abstract framework. It also gets very interestingly into issues of scale. So another theme beyond the tenets or the principles approach has been to look at energy justice from a multi-scalar or a whole systems lens. And I'm a big fan of this paper by Noel Healy, Jenny Stevens, and Stephanie Malin that looks at the embodied energy justices. So the energy justices that are often hidden across the entire life cycle or supply chain of a technology. And there are two particularly interesting things about this framework that I applaud. The first is it critiques energy scholarship for obsessing, perhaps justifiably, over this box of site of combustion and production. Where these technologies are used dominates our thinking about them. It's the household adopting solar. It's the home that's incorporating an EV. It's the wind farm. It's the biomass plant. That's where we do our environmental impact assessment. That's where we focus a lot of our work, wind farms, solar parks. And yet in focusing only on where those technologies are used, we end up obscuring all the other aspects of the technology, from the mineral extraction to processing to transport to construction, to things like disposal or waste or the afterlives. The other thing that I think is quite salient about the framework is it also reveals the sacrifice zones that are embedded in those supply chains and a propensity of impacts, violence, human rights abuses, environmental destruction, mental illness, gender, toxicity, and waste. So it's a very holistic framework that helps unpack the hazards of our energy choices. Now, Noel and his colleagues applied this framework to fossil fuels. They actually looked at coal. And they traced coal's impacts all the way from extraction in Colombia to things like disposal and fly ash in the United States. We picked this up and were inspired to ask, okay, we all understand that we have these hidden sacrifice zones among fossil fuels. Do we also have them among low carbon options? We hope not. And if they do exist among low carbon options, what might they be? And so we embarked on a project funded by Innopaths, where we selected 4 prominent European transitions: nuclear power in France, solar energy, household solar energy in Germany, battery electric vehicles in Norway, and smart meters in Great Britain. Each of these transitions gets you 2 supply side and 2 demand side options. So nuclear and solar are supply, EVs and smart meters are more behavior and demand use technologies. They get you 4 different temporalities. Nuclear power accelerates with the Mesmer plan in the 70s. Solar accelerates in the late 90s and early 2000s with both of Germany's feed-in tariffs. There was one in 1990 and another one in 2000. BEVs accelerate in the mid-2000s, and very recently, the past decade, and the smart meter transition is ongoing. We hope to offer smart meters to all homes and small businesses in the UK by the end of 2024. Finally, all 4 of these transitions are also big or world leading. France has about 75% of its commercial electricity from nuclear power. That's one of the largest shares of any industrialized country. They're also the largest exporter of nuclear power in the world. Germany is the world leader in the per capita use of solar energy. They have rates far higher than China or the US or Bangladesh, which has a very nice solar home systems program. Norway is the undisputed market leader for EVs. 70% of new car sales last year were EVs. Their per capita uptake is 50 times greater than China, which is the biggest market in absolute terms. And the smart meters rollout has been called the infrastructural challenge of this generation in the UK, where they're planning to disseminate 56 million units for gas and electricity in a matter of about 10 years. So it is a major household energy transition. We embarked on a mixed methods, multi-sequence research design. I'll fly through these slides because I know many of you probably care less about methods and more about findings. For the first phase, we stuck with those 4 transitions, and we did a series of expert interviews where we asked questions among very knowledgeable experts. Questions like, who wins from this transition? Who loses from this transition? What might be some of the impacts beyond Europe? And what policy mechanisms could we use to make the transition more just? And I'm very, very pleased that even though we were explicit about our questions, we weren't hiding that we were looking at injustices, the access that we got to important stakeholders was incredibly strong. The Atomic Energy Commission and EDF in France still spoke to us, knowing we were coming in to ask these hard questions. The Ministry of Economic Affairs in Germany, or the German Solar Association, the Ministry of Transport in Norway, or the Norwegian Electric Vehicle Association, or here in the UK base, which is the Department for Energy, as well as Smart Energy GB, which is the official government voice of the rollout. So again, we got to speak directly to the incumbents managing the transitions to get their views. However, because we were also trying to benefit from this principle of recognition, there is tension with only asking elites and experts what they think. So we wanted to also include methods that garnered views from the public. So we did a series of community focus groups. While these interviews were predominantly in capital cities like London and Paris and Oslo and Berlin, we intentionally selected our focus groups to be areas that were more rural, areas like Lewis or Stavanger. And finally, because only a few dozen people could come to the focus groups, we wanted a third method that also captured broad public views. Also in focus groups, if you've run them, sometimes they're dominated by some people who work well in groups. Other people stay silent. So we wanted also a technique that enabled people to open up. And there's nothing that gets people to open up like the anonymity of the internet. And so we joined internet forums as the final part of our research methodology, where we had more than 2 million members, saw our questions potentially, and offered further answers. So it's a great way of getting you data from experts, from focus groups, and from the anonymous public via prominent internet forums where they were discussing the energy transitions in question. So what did we find? So I will say firstly that we didn't only ask about injustices. The first question that we actually asked was about the benefits. This was to get respondents warmed up, but also to avoid bias, because we didn't want to do a study that was only about what's wrong. We also wanted to do a study with what's right. And we were pretty rigorous in this. We coded all of those interviews and focus groups and internet forums and did frequency analysis to see how much things came up. This shows you the co-benefits for nuclear energy in France. And we have similar data tables that will go through all of the identified co-benefits. And I'm quite happy to say we identified more than 100 co-benefits to these transitions. Interestingly, some of these were economic, which we kind of expected: fuel savings, jobs, export security, profits, and revenues. Some were environmental, which we also expected, right? Things like better air quality or avoided emissions or reduced land use impacts. But we expected this. And you can see in the title of the article, it's beyond cost and carbon, because the other co-benefits were not economic or environmental. We had a whole 77 other benefits that go beyond that economic environmental framing. Social benefits like pride or positive feelings of adventurousness when you adopt an EV, or technical benefits like innovation learning or coupling. Smart meters become coupled with maybe prosuming or peer-to-peer trading, or political benefits like reduced energy independence. And I think what's interesting as well is these co-benefits were not consolidated in any single transition. They're almost evenly distributed across the four. So it's not like you can say smart meters got all the co-benefits. You know, even nuclear has 30 co-benefits. Nuclear has as many co-benefits as solar, according to our data. However, while we identified 128 co-benefits, we identified almost an equal number of injustices. And this, again, this shows you the injustices for France for nuclear power, for the distributive approach. We used the Tenants approach for this paper, so we classified injustices by distribution, procedure, recognition, and cosmopolitanism. And again, we coded them so you can see how much they come up in order of frequency. So you get a sense of something came up once randomly or it came up a lot. And again, almost as many, 120 distinct injustices. And we mutually exclusively coded them, which means that an injustice could only go in one category. We couldn't have an injustice appear twice in both recognition or distribution. And while we were perhaps expecting distributive injustices to dominate the sample, we were very surprised that recognition concerns came second. We actually thought it would be procedural concerns. So this is quite troubling because it implies the second group that's losing from the transitions is already the most vulnerable groups. What also blows my mind is that there were more identified injustices with smart meters than nuclear power. Now, to be fair, there were also more co-benefits identified with smart meters than nuclear power. So it could just be our great British respondents had a lot to say. It could also be that smart meters are viewed as more intrusive because they're in the home, where nuclear power is more centralized and distinct. And there could also be cultural things at play, right? Where maybe the English feel more comfortable critiquing things, where our French respondents didn't feel comfortable critiquing nuclear power, given its connection to secrecy and pride and a whole bunch of the long history of nuclear design in France. Even then, solar PV still had a fair number of injustices. So again, we see an almost even distribution between 24 and 34 injustices with each transition. It wasn't like one transition had only 5 and another had 80. So this is also quite troubling because it suggests, independent of the technology, our low carbon transitions are impinging on justice concerns. And remember, one of those questions that we asked was about whole systems impacts. Tell me about the injustices that are beyond each of the 4 countries. And here we used this whole systems approach, very similar to those from Healy, although we went a bit deeper. You can see we have different dimensions of space and different dimensions of time. Different dimensions of space go beyond Healy. We talk about impacts at the local scale, some at the national scale, and some at the supranational scale. And then we also talked about impacts across the supply chain, some with production and manufacturing, some with consumption, and some with disposal and waste and recycling. So it gets you a matrix of different concerns. And we applied that matrix to our data and also identified almost 50 injustices around the world. And everywhere here in red that you see an injustice is an injustice that was identified from our material beyond the 4 countries. So this is also quite troubling because it really highlights the multi-scalar impact these transitions are having as far away as Canada, disrupting tar sands viability, the United States, interference with coal exports from Peabody, lithium mines in South America, cobalt mines and scrapyards in sub-Saharan Africa, interference with LNG exports in Australia, reliance on low-wage manufacturing in China, the displacement of dirty vehicles from Norway to Russia. All of that comes out of our data, and it really underscores the tenacity that these transitions get co-opted in these globally circulating injustices. We also identified very specific communities that were at risk, whether it was electronic waste workers who have to handle the waste streams with smart meters and EVs, or it's those who are at risk in mineral supply chains, mining rare earths, lithium, cobalt, and copper, or potential wineries, which I'll talk about in a moment, or potential slaves. You see the connection between mining and modern slavery, as well as child labor, or women and children, where you see extraction interfering with gender equality and promoting things like prostitution, subjugation of minorities, as well as women, as well as the disruption of unions and labor. So we can start to piece together a whole inventory of vulnerable groups. And that's where our second phase of research came in. We were quite concerned. You can see here in this review of 20 years of research on the geography of energy transitions across 332 cases. So a huge evidence base. Look at the right. The same vulnerable groups keep losing: non-human species, local communities, farmers, the rural poor, workers, and indigenous peoples, as well as future generations, are harmed in 35 to 78% of our cases. They're harmed again and again and again. And the fact that it's local communities who are harmed in 3/4 of the time is perverse, because it implies that people actually adopting these technologies then suffer many of their immediate impacts or injustices. And the impacts on indigenous groups are also very stark. We mapped out all the specifically identified indigenous groups, Aboriginal peoples, or ethnic minorities at risk from transitions. And look here, not only is the list really long, many of these indigenous groups are under threat from multiple transitions. Look at the Mapuche in Chile, under threat from wind development, hydropower, forest development, tree plantations, right? Or those in Bolivia, EVs, smart grids, storage. And here's the really troubling thing. This table, this is just the first third of it. It goes on and on. More than 60 indigenous groups are at threat with our low carbon interventions like biofuel, solar energy, tree plantations, hydropower, and wind. To get a closer look at some of those vulnerable groups, we then did a second phase of Innopath's work. And that second phase was, again, mixed methods. We did a mix of expert interviews, community interviews, and site visits. And we visited and spent time with 4 of these communities. And they were French vineyards for nuclear power, electronic waste scrapyard workers for smart meters, cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I led a team for a month in the DRC, visiting miners, mining sites, artisanal mining sites, industrial mining sites, cobalt processing centers, cobalt training centers. And our final case was factories in Eastern Germany who were no longer making solar panels. So we did a very nice embedded ethnographic approach in those 4 communities, the first of which was French wineries. And yes, this is a reason to come work at SPRU. We did send a research fellow to the Rhone Valley to go to different wineries, and he did come back with a trunk full of wine. He also got to go to 3 wine fairs and a few wine trading exhibitions. Poor him, right? Poor him. But here you can see quotes from the winemakers themselves that they are kind of under threat from nuclear power, because nuclear power changes the microclimate, changes the land and the value of the land, and it also raises concerns about pollution over tritium, over other radioactive materials in the water supply. And you can see, a winemaker even told us it was a mistake. It was honestly a mistake to believe that we would not be hurt by nuclear power development. And other wineries, especially those near Triskatin, talked about losses of sales of 40% each year, every time there was an incident. And remember, these are small and medium enterprises on the margin. So losing 40% of sales means they may not exist after these types of incidents happen. So in this particular case, you see nuclear power leading to the dispossession of another French cultural sector, wineries. Second, and this just shows you how close those vineyards get to the nuclear infrastructure. This is Triskatin. And you can see the vineyards are up well within the perimeter zone. The IAEA sets a 25-kilometer safety zone in urban areas, but that doesn't apply in rural areas. And so the vineyards literally go right up to the nuclear infrastructure. And again, the winemaker told us, imagine if this was on the bottle of wine. No one would ever actually purchase it ever again. Our second case was Eastern Germany, Bitterfeld-Wolfen. We sent a research team there to talk to union leaders, mayors, and factory workers. And again, this quote is amazing because we never anticipated this would be a vulnerable group. The real vulnerable group from solar is not flat dwellers or those who can't own homes or coal workers or nuclear workers. The real vulnerable group is the solar workers themselves, the 100,000 who've lost their jobs and did not have trade union protection. Workers in the solar energy sector are a vulnerable population. Or if you want an even pithier quote, this comes from a mayor who told us, Berlin got the electricity, we got the ashes. And if you visit these locations, you can really see abandoned factoryscapes, marginalized communities that have lost their schools, their pensions, their jobs, and then not only have to deal with reduced revenue, they then have to protect and stop vandalism and maintain these decaying infrastructures so they aren't a health and safety risk to their local people. And you can just see here, I put this because the sun park used to be the world leading sector where the most solar energy was made. This is where Q cells operated before they went bankrupt. And now it's completely shut down and abandoned. A multi-billion-dollar facility that has been discarded and abandoned. So think of all the lost effort and intellectual property and resources and money and attention that went into making this cluster, only now to have it collapse. Our third case was electronic waste. And again, we matched this to smart meters, but it also applies to a whole bunch of other low carbon innovations. Anything that uses electronics, in-home displays, digitization, energy storage, fuel cells, reactors, you name it, pretty much. It will need, it'll create electronic waste flows. We chose this one in particular, though, because 70% of e-waste in the UK goes to this scrapyard in Ghana, which is a former colony called Ogbogboshi. And we led a research team there. And again, look at this quote. You have 100,000 people living here in abject poverty. It is the biggest dump for scrap metal and e-waste in the world. You have children as young as 6 engaged in the business. And I saw them sleeping on bricks. They don't even have pillows or beds. They sleep on a brick. They miss school or they get sick. This one talked about someone dying at the age of 12. They cough, they fall sick. They dedicate their precious youth, right, to actually handling our hazardous and toxic waste streams. You also have extremely high rates of community pollution near Ogbogboshi. Much of it is from the direct incineration and burning of e-waste. So this shows you they burn a lot of the electronics because it's easier to get the copper or the gold inside them after it melts down. But it creates a very thick carcinogenic smoke, which then wafts throughout all of Accra, which is why, by the way, that community risks are actually higher than occupational risks. Levels of environmental exposure are higher in the surrounding community than they are in the workers themselves. Why? Because the workers are only exposed while they work, but the community is exposed 24/7 where they live. You also have interesting undertones of racism, where it's often refugees and minorities from Togo and Benin who are forced to do the worst work, picking through scrap after it's burnt, where there are other ethnic majorities who retain control of the scrapyard business. And I mentioned environmental toxicity. If I was here with Tomislav in Slovenia right now, I would say, what is this thing in the middle? What is that white blob? And I'd get people to guess. It's a cow. So they're literally drinking the milk from cows that eat the waste. And I also saw chickens and other poultry, and there's a vegetable market actually behind me. And that water they still rely on for drinking. So this also explains why life expectancy for a place like Ogbogboshi is about half where it is for the rest of Ghana, which is already about half of what it should be in a modern industrialized country that provides adequate healthcare. So people are literally dying to handle our e-waste flows from low carbon transitions. And as if that wasn't depressing enough, the final case we did is we did visit the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This is the southeastern part near the Zambian border, where they have huge metal resources, especially for cobalt and copper. It's been called the geologic scandal of Africa because it's so concentrated. And we sent research teams to Lubumbashi, Lakashi, and Kolwezi. And again, ASM is artisanal scale mining. For cobalt is not living, it's dying. The moment you step into the mine, a hidden clock starts to tick. And the ways that you can get killed or injured are multiple. Dust, silicosis, mercury, drowning, getting crushed in a mine collapse. You can even get the plague because a lot of these mining teams bring in food. And also, if you're in the middle of a mine, where do you defecate? Where do you piss? In the mine, which means rats and cockroaches enter the mine. You can get malaria, right? And even if these things don't kill you, they can permanently disable you. And there are all sorts of stories of mining groups that get lost or eaten up in the jungle and are never heard from again. Mining there is especially low tech. This shows you a miner who is so poor, he's mining without shoes. He's got his flip-flops there in the corner. He's mining without a ladder. He's mining without a shovel. He's mining without adequate ventilation or PPE, and also without adequate structural support in the mine. So it's a very, very risky process, which also sees dozens of accidents every year. It's finally a sector that is prone to child labor and negative impacts on children. This shows you children combing through mine tailings. These mine tailings are toxic and sometimes radioactive if there's trace elements of uranium in the mine. They have no PPE. And again, these children are as young as 5. Or this one, this is a 7-year-old cobalt trader taking a half sack of cobalt and copper to a Chinese depot in Lubumbashi. And again, no PPE and not exactly meeting standards of child protection either. All right, so what do we make of this as I wrap this up? I think first of all, unfortunately, we need better tools. Even if you're talking about the co-benefits or the injustices, we're very good in the community at capturing things like carbon and air pollution and things like maybe jobs. We're not so good at the other dimensions, the political dimensions, the social dimensions. How do you capture guilt or pride in a modeling data set? And I think as well, as much as we looked at innovations in isolate, smart meters in the UK, nuclear reactors in France, these can often get coupled. Smart meters could get coupled with solar, EVs could couple with storage, which may actually suggest that we start to look at coupled energy systems going forward rather than single transitions. It also suggests, if you buy that first bullet point, that many of these dimensions are beyond economics. We have to move beyond economic instruments when we think about changing behavior. We need instruments that intersect with identity and culture and pride and guilt. Unfortunately, our research strongly suggests that while we still advocate the transitions, and if you wanted a very purely simple thing, right, we said 128 co-benefits, 120 injustices. At least there are more co-benefits than injustices. So we're not saying don't do the transitions, but we are saying the way that they are done is certainly too toxic, exploitative, patriarchal, racist, destructive, and unjust. We have got to make these transitions better. Injustices also were not just evil nuclear power. We also see them emerged with tools of energy democracy like solar, as well as end-use devices like EVs or storage or in-home displays or batteries. And what's ironic is many of these tools are being used here in Europe to fight energy poverty, even though they're exacerbating poverty in other parts of the world. And also, these issues of governance remind us that it's not even about the technology. It may not be that nuclear power is bad. It's the way that the French government did it by hiding costs, promoting secrecy, not adequately storing waste, not adequately reporting incidents. It's not that smart meters are bad. Maybe the way that the Great British rollout was supplier-led and very inefficient, and that smart meters didn't work if you switch suppliers. And that you had a whole debate about SMETS 1 versus SMETS 2, where about 3 million meters that were installed were obsolete after they were installed, right? So you have all these governance conundrums that impact justice just as much as the technology. So this is another coupling, by the way, technology plus governance. The cosmopolitan concerns remind us that these impacts cascade across scales. And this is quite troublesome because European transitions have impacts far beyond Europe. If it's nuclear power, I mentioned some. I didn't mention things like uranium mining. So most French nuclear reactors are fueled by uranium from Niger, Kazakhstan, Canada, and Australia, all of which have impacts in those communities. I didn't talk about nuclear waste. I didn't talk about decommissioning. For solar, I talked a little bit about manufacturing in Germany. I didn't talk about low-wage manufacturing in China, people working unfair factory shifts. There was even a report last week or 2 weeks ago about Uyghur labor, slave labor being used in solar supply chains. I also didn't talk about some of the waste streams that you can see at solar factories in Malaysia or the US or China. For smart meters, you have justice impacts that occur at the front and back end. At the front end, they also need copper and cobalt for their materials and displays. And at the back end, they're creating electronic waste flows. And electric vehicles also at the front end and the back end rely on materials and create waste streams. And then you also have the issue of cheap petrol cars that flood other markets when they leave Europe. And I'm quite worried that I believe in SDG 7 So for those of you that don't know, Sustainable Development Goal 7 is about kind of modern energy for all. And I believe that clean energy is a human right, but how we currently secure it trades off with too many other human rights: gender, biodiversity, industrial strategy. And this is leading to a very vicious green on green conflict, or even poor on poor conflict. One group of poor wins, one group of poor loses. And I think in the end, this really underscores the value of pursuing whole systems approaches that don't mask these inequalities, right? We cannot obscure what we've called this decarbonization divide, where Europe gets cleaner and healthier, but only at the expense of Africa, Asia, and other peripheral regions. So I think this harkens back to our research designs as well. Choose multi-scalar approaches that help capture these intricacies so they're no longer invisible. And with that, Tomislav, I'm happy to turn it back to you.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, I think I have questions for the whole day, but I don't think we have enough time for that, but I'll still start with my questions. So we were dealing now with justice dimensions of low carbon transitions, but how to compare this justice dimensions or injustices happening with sticking to the status quo, so not entering the energy transition. And maybe adding to this, what was shown, it has a bit of broader dimension than just the low carbon transition. So it shows changes in technology, but it shows that the socio-economic system didn't change because there are the same patterns going on. Is maybe that the main point from the research, and maybe what needs to be done for energy transitions to be just, how to address the problems of the injustices happening?
So just 3 quick responses, Tomislav. I want to save time for the other questions too. In one of the papers, we have a whole section on policy mechanisms, which I didn't cover. So we have, I think, 20 or 30 suggestions from our stakeholders and respondents that talked about how to make them more just, whether it's things like PPE and training for the miners, right, or better union protections in Germany, or better supply chain management from firms that are using, some of these materials. So at least we have that. The second thing is that in the decarbonization divide piece, we kind of had 2 separate conclusions about how these transitions impacted injustice. In some cases, especially the Congo and Ghana, they don't create the vulnerability. They take a pre-existing vulnerability and make it worse. So this is your kind of point about structure. These systems and transitions are implicated in capitalist and exploitative structures that were there already: colonial relationships, right? Mining supply chains. And they were made worse by the transitions, but they weren't created in the first place by them. However, in a second class of injustices, they were unique to the transition. The transition itself created a new vulnerability that wasn't there before. And the examples here were France and Germany, where the transition itself created jobs that then took away, or interfered distinctly with wine production in ways that weren't happening. So I think that matters, right? Because in some transitions, you'll reify an existing injustice, and in others, you'll create a new one. And the final point, which is very true, is we didn't look at the status quo. So one of our questions wasn't, what's the impact of doing nothing, or what's the impact of not doing the transition? We only asked, what are the co-benefits to the transition, and what are the injustices to the transition? We do have new work in Sintran, a new project we're doing, that does ask this question, and we've created, my colleague Laura Kanger has created a neat framework that does capture 3 types of injustice. We have injustices with the status quo, injustices with getting rid of the status quo, and injustices with phasing something new in, like solar. So I like that because it does imply there are kind of 3 scopes for injustice, either way that you move. It's like a justice, justice, justice trade-off. But we're only starting to grapple with those dimensions because they're so complex.
Okay, thank you. Then a question from Sibyl Lustenberg from Switzerland. She's referring to the presentation, I think the German cases of solar workers and losing their jobs. So she's asking, why do or did they lose their jobs? Because this was also shown as an injustice case.
Yeah, complicated question partly. The short answer is Germany's feed-in tariff, Germany's feed-in tariff was meant to be industrial strategy. It was meant to catalyze a whole wave of manufacturing and revitalize the German sector. And it did for a few years, but no one practically anticipated that the Chinese would come in and also make further improvements to economies of scale and essentially undercut the German industrial plan. And so you had a huge, basically, boom and bust cycle where you had massive infrastructure deployed, jobs created, and then taken away about 5 or 7 years later. And I think the three reasons why they lost their jobs, the biggest one was market forces, right? These market forces were at work, and in a way they benefited the world because solar energy got cheap. But it was so cheap that Germany couldn't afford to keep their workers working and meeting their standards. The second element here is politics. The German solar workers were not unionized, or they didn't have strong unions in the same way that coal and nuclear did. So while Germany has a very neat coal phase-out package, the solar workers got nothing. And so there was also this kind of question about worker protections and why the renewable energy sector didn't have the same strength and political capital as the coal sector. And the final bit is more a kind of legacy of Eastern Germany versus Western Germany. Eastern Germany was seen, I think, as just a sacrifice zone. It was acceptable to German politicians to see that region go. It's a region known for populism. It's a region now known for far-right politics and the AfD. And so it's also kind of a place that Berlin planners were comfortable writing off because it was a peripheral place. It was worth it. So I think those three reasons help explain why. Global capitalist forces, a cultural notion of what's acceptable losses, and poor union support within Eastern Germany.
Okay, then we have a question from Nienke van Oefelen, Netherlands. How do you distinguish recognition justice from distributive or procedural justice, since they often seem to overlap a bit?
Absolutely, fantastic question. And we grappled with this immediately. Initially, we wanted to do a framework that didn't even do recognition. It was just going to be distribution, procedure, and cosmopolitanism. We were quite inspired by recognition. It's been coming into the justice literature in the past 10 years. Nancy Fraser has written some very powerful books, and my close colleagues like Kirsten Jenkins and Darren McCauley also use it. So they convinced us. They're like, you should be using recognition. But then how do you use it? So for us, recognition was coded last, as in a recognition in justice could be distributive or procedural or cosmopolitan, but if it hit a particularly vulnerable group, we classified it as recognition. So it's the messiest of the categories. And it basically conflates those three other levels of justice, but as long as it impacted a vulnerable group, a minority, a particular stakeholder, then we classified it as recognition.
Okay, then another question from Naeem Patel. The question is there literature that combines energy justice scholarship with political and economic theories of power? And if these energy justice dimension consequences of power relations? So
no. I mean, there's no direct work that combines justice theories and power theories together into a meta theory. Maybe you could, because they are actually looking at very similar things. Same with theories of political ecology are also there. There are good works that look at power in transitions. And so here the work of Flor Avellino and Lena Parsh, I can't pronounce her last name, are quite good. Marie-Claire Brisbaugh and I actually have a review looking at elite power and transitions. And we show you these other theories of power. Marie-Claire also has one called Power Shifts. They're quite neat. And there are theories of power relations, and there are theories of types of power, and there's theories of resistance to power, like James C. Scott, Weapons of the Weak. But that tends to be a separate space than theories of justice. So I think it might be neat for anyone to start to think through how you couple justice thinking theoretically with power thinking, because I haven't seen anything done yet explicitly.
Okay, then a question from Andrej Clemens from Slovenia. Bit of a comment before the question. A part of Friday for Future movement in Slovenia is well aware of trade-offs of renewable energy technology and believes that nuclear is more fair. So maybe a comment from your side here, and the question relates to this is, where are, however, the best possibilities to improve fairness? Can we at all distinguish between the technologies, or is it more important to focus on improving processes and institutions that reduces injustices?
Very good question. I think, yes, you want to avoid these dichotomies. Another dichotomy people say is technology or behavior. This could be a dichotomy of governance or technology. I'd say they're both important. I'd say in particular contexts, governance could be more important than technology, and in other contexts, technology could be more important than governance. It kind of depends on the case, but I think they both matter. And the weight or the import of their mattering will differentiate by the transition in question. But look at both, basically. The question about nuclear powers is interesting. My own take is that nuclear power may make sense, but as Marie-Claire said, only in situations where you account for all of its costs. Nuclear often looks artificially cheap because you exclude uranium impacts. You almost always exclude waste storage, which is a public good. You almost always exclude liability. So you have extreme restrictions on liability. It's called Price-Anderson in the US. Otherwise, nuclear reactors couldn't operate because if they have an accident, it'd be trillions of dollars of risk. And decommissioning. And usually if you include those four things into the cost of nuclear, it goes up by a factor of 10. So I think wherever nuclear makes sense in places that it is lower cost and it does have good waste storage and it has good involvement, you can do it. But I think in situations where you're pushing those onto other generations or other taxpayers, you shouldn't do it. And the same is true for solar. I was seeing a piece last week in the Harvard Business Review that said if you account for the waste streams, the price of solar goes up by a factor of 3. So I'm for a full accounting of all of these costs across all of these energy systems so we can better prioritize what communities ought to pursue. I've seen good evidence to suggest that in most cases, energy efficiency is usually first. I've seen evidence that suggests that even when you account for their costs, wind and solar and geothermal are often good as well. You then have a middle collection of options that are moderately okay: hydro, big hydro, nuclear, gas. And then you have the options that are the worst, usually coal and oil, and sometimes waste to energy and landfill gas capture. So I think that kind of roughly at a high level categorization works into what energy systems are best for most communities. But it is up to communities themselves to decide. If they want to choose one that is worse for them for other criteria, jobs, legacy, security of supply, domestic industrial strategy, then they can. But I think the key is informing them so that they make informed decisions that include all of the costs and don't hide them. Otherwise, you're just socializing risk to other areas of society and to the future.
Okay, how much time do you still have?
5 minutes, 6 minutes.
Okay, then let's make use of them. So Satoru Mizoguchi from Japan. First question is, why are you so productive publishing papers almost every month like monthly magazine journalist? Secondly, may I ask what made mainstream social science picks ethics and justice as legitimate subject and since when?
Yeah, so thank you for I think it was a compliment, although I guess it depends on the quality of those outputs. We work a lot in teams. So if you notice, almost all of my papers have co-authors. We're supported by projects. So I think part of it is we're well-funded. I think part of it is a lot of us at SPRU are passionate. So publishing and getting research out there is more than just a job. It's part of our mission of promoting low carbon transitions or justice and human rights. And the final thing is it's also mentoring. At least half of most of the stuff that I write or Marie-Claire writes tends to be with students or early career researchers, often with them as first authors. We even have PhD by papers here at Sussex, where a PhD student will write 3 to 5 papers with their supervisors. So that also accounts for a huge volume of output, where it's publishing by, it's learning by doing, basically, publishing by teaching. The second thing about ethics is interesting because if you take a very big picture that goes back thousands of years, ethics used to be front and center in educational curricula. Like to the Greeks, ethics was as important as maths. And it's just kind of been in the past 300 years that like ethics and moral studies have marginalized in importance. And we've come to think of other things as more important, like business studies or economics or physics, right? In some ways too, science has become the new religion for some, which means that the scientific disciplines have cascaded in their importance and the humanities and the arts have become less important. So I think in a way, justice has always been there as central to the human condition, and it's probably coming back. And I think in many ways, many of the other disciplines are actually doing justice work. They just don't know it because they're talking about power and ethics and morality, or they're valuing human life, or they're making assumptions about equity and fairness. Economics is in a way just quantifying justice. And so I think if you look closer, justice has never been peripheralized. It's just been reshaped and reframed as other disciplines seek to pursue justice things.
Okay, then just two quick questions from my side. The first one, currently in Slovenia, there's a process of adopting the national strategy for coal exit. So the one coal power plant that we have in Slovenia should work until 2054, but the plan in the strategy is until 2033. So it means faster coal exit. How to compare the justice dimensions here with the local justice dimension and the global one. So the miners and the unions of the miners are, of course, and the region itself is against the earlier coal exit. But on the other hand, we have like a global responsibility as a developed country to end the coal use faster as in some other countries. So how to compare this, or how to combine both of the views?
Well, that's the challenge, is justice trade-offs occur not only between principles and not only between technologies. So already in the presentation today, you saw multiple ways in which availability or sustainability all trade off in different ways. And you also saw all the ways in which solar or nuclear have benefits, but also costs. I think the third way they trade off is between stakeholder groups, right? And so it's very true that local communities may lose, but national institutions may win. Or even better, the globe may win as we perhaps displace emissions. And that means that, people suffer. This is very apt and why Noel Healy used the word sacrifice zones, because the assumption is no matter what, at some point, someone will sacrifice, even for a low carbon goal. And I think it's just important in justice thinking that we discuss who that is. We avoid these utopian discourses that presume there's no losers. But we also avoid these pessimistic thinkings from the lobbyists that say we can't do it at all, it's going to crush the country. Neither are true. We need a more nuanced, honest discussion that just weighs the pros and cons based on the evidence. And I think that will help you navigate not only what those risks are between groups, but then you can go the next step and say what's acceptable. What do we deem as our society to be an acceptable distribution of risk? And I think that goes from risks as predetermined to risks as socially constructed and negotiated. And I think that justice principles help you guide that decision. It has to be fair, impartial, independent, transparent, accountable, etc. So I think those principles will help as you have this very tough discussion about justice dimensions.
Okay, then the last question from my side. So Marie talked before on the obstacles that are more on the social part of the system than in the engineering and technology part. And maybe a question here for you on the bias in research funding that was also mentioned by Marie. So the majority of the funding goes to technology, research, engineering, and less for the social sciences and humanities in energy. But we see that the main obstacles are here in the social part. So how to refer to this? Or
I think you're partly right, Tomislav. I think there's still a role for future technical innovation, right? We need combined cycle turbines to get more efficient. Gosh, we need less e-waste in our supply chains and less materials. So things like state-of-the-art cobalt mining, we should research that. There's CCS, we should research that potentially. So I think there's still EVs with better range, solar with better conversion efficiency, storage with better cost dynamics. So I don't think there's no role for technical innovation. And if you look previously, we've had amazing innovations so far. The innovation of an LED light is like 10,000 times better than a flame. And the innovation of a state-of-the-art combined cycle gas turbine has a thermal efficiency of 80%, whereas 50 years ago it was 30%. So we've more than doubled the efficiency. Same with the fuel economy of a car. So I think there's a role for that, and it's important. But you're also right that there's a role for all the other social stuff. I think for now, this obsession with technology fits partly with what I just said. It's almost religious. David Nye even has a term called the technological sublime, that we come to attach sublimity to different technologies because they're our savior. Things like big dams and nuclear reactors. Policymakers like them as well because it's a technical fix. We don't have to change lifestyles if we just develop fusion or a new technology. And the final thing they like is it subscribes to a very simplified notion of innovation. The problem becomes as simple as fund R&D into this and fund commercialization here. So it fits in this very kind of stylized linear notion of what innovation is, which is very attractive when you're trying to disperse funding. So that's that's the allure of technology. But I'm with you. I think that even if we say that technical innovation is half the problem, so we should put half of our resources into that, the other half is not. The other half is non-technical. The other half is business models, policies, power, barriers, politics, gender, justice. That's the other half. And that just means to me that the social sciences and humanities deserve equal footing for funding. We're not the marginalized peripheral partner. We should be as well funded as the engineers. And maybe that 50-50 split is a bit arbitrary, but I think that there is at least some elegance there. If half the problem is socio-political, then half the research should be focused on socio-political dimensions.